The nature of global security is changing fast. Here's the reason why. In June, Russia launched close to 5,500 drones in a wave of attacks on the Ukraine, another 2,000 in the first 9 days of July, and reports suggest Moscow may soon fire as many as 1,000 drones in a single night. These drone attacks demonstrate how small, inexpensive, unmanned airborne weapons can search out and destroy tanks, armored vehicles, and bombers. Drones as attack, surveillance, and weapons of defense, coupled with AI's ability to geomap strategic sites and personnel, are changing the way wars are being waged. In January 2023, the United States gave Ukraine 31 M1 Abrams tanks, the most sophisticated tank in the world. As of the 1st of July this year, all but 4 of those tanks have been destroyed, and all but one of the tanks that were destroyed were blown up by Russian drones. The Ukrainians have been equally deft at destroying conventional kinetic weapons of war using drones, but not in the numbers Russia is developing or deploying. Welcome to Security, Disruptors, War, Drones, and National Security. Our panelists are retired Canadian General Rick Hillier, Georgi Janjalia, former member of the Georgian Special Operations Forces and Military Intelligence, and Paul Lushenko, assistant professor at the U.S. Army War College, along with Calvin Krusty, a critical risk team. Brian Kelly, the director of the Unmanned Systems Lab at Randolph-Macon Academy, was scheduled to join us. Sadly, he is having to respond to a family emergency and can't join us today. One last thing, if you're wanting to ask a question of the panel, please go to slido.com and using the password security, send in your questions, and then I will use those to direct them to our panel. Now to our panel. General Hillier, I'd like to start with you. Have drones completely changed the way wars are being fought?
Well, Stuart, thank you very much. And I'm glad to be on the panel here today and just have this discussion. And so my answer to that would be very short, yes. And here's what I would say. As we watch the wars that are being fought now, and whether it is in Ukraine with Ukraine, Russia, or whether it is in the Middle East with Israel and Iran, or actually Israel and Iran's sort of technicals through Hamas and Hezbollah, we see that the fundamental strategy, the fundamental operational prerogatives, and the fundamental tactics have changed. And what you're getting is a military approach to these things, which is absolutely incredible. We talked way back in the 1990s, about a revolution in military affairs and how, because of communications and because of speed and because of tactical ability, we could do things in a way that were entirely different. All we did was talk. We actually never revolutionized, and the military affairs remained very consistent to what they have been for literally several hundred years, and if you look at where we are right now in military forces across the Western world, we essentially are in the same structures. And let's face it, the drone warfare impetus has really been discussed and impacted upon the land battle more so than anywhere else. And yes, I do know that we have the attacks by the Ukrainians on the Russian fleet, etc. But it has been in the land battle by and large that we have seen the impact. But since the U.S. Civil War, and even before that, we are still in essentially the same structures, divisional structures that we had now for more than 100 years. And so we talk revolution in military affairs, and despite going through disruptors throughout the century, and whether that was the machine gun, or whether that was the train, or whether that was a tank, or whether that was a dive bomber, which was going to change everything, or whether that indeed was an anti-tank guided missile like the Sagar back in 1973, if you were as old as I am and can remember that, when we thought it was going to change land warfare fundamentally, and guess what? It did not. I think the drones are a different kettle of fish. They have changed the face of warfare. The folks who are fighting right now see that, respond to it each day, and quite literally live or die by their ability to do so. The problem is right now, as I see it, and I know we're going to have these discussions here, is how far out of the Eastern Oblasts and the Iranian-Israeli conflict, how far back from that have we taken those lessons learned and the impact upon warfare as it will be prosecuted anywhere these days. And that is to say, with strategic drones right through to tactical drones, But most importantly, and I'll finish with this, most importantly, warfare has changed not because of the drone itself. The drone is a platform. And frankly, we've had drones, if you will, for a long period of time. I mean, let's go back to, the late World War II in the Pacific. Effectively, we had drones, which were called kamikazes, and they happened to be piloted airplanes, but they did essentially what the drones are doing now without the use of individuals. And so I would say that what's occurred now that is making the change, in part has made it, is the application of the technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, applied with those drones to fight an enemy that's trying to kill you. And I'll just give one example here, and then I'll stop and let you come back in. And the example is this. We've known for years now that countries like, China scoop up every piece of intelligence they can get on people who are very young today, starting off in appointments that potentially offer the opportunity to be very senior in some years. And whether that's a young Rick Hillier as a brand new lieutenant joining the military, and they scoop up everything that they can on me, store it because it easily can be done. So, and then years later, when I'm commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan or chief of defense staff for Canada, then they have everything possible on me. And they combine that with artificial intelligence to discern what my commander's intent would be. And commander's intent is what enables troops on the battlefield to fight, knowing what the commander is trying to achieve as opposed to exactly how to do something. And a country that scooped up that information, combined it with artificial intelligence, can now understand my commander's intent probably as well as perhaps better than me. In other words, I would end up fighting myself. If you combine that kind of technology with the drone platform itself to specifically take out the targets which are important to me and my commander's intent, you have revolutionized military affairs. You have revolutionized how we fight wars. The question is, how far back have we taken the lessons from Ukraine and from Iran, and how far into our Western military defense structures have we carried this? I'll stop there.
Paul, can I ask you, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth last week announced initiatives that basically said the United States is not going to allow drone technology to surge beyond its capacity. How much ground at the moment do you think that the United States has to make up? Because if we take a look at what the Ukrainians, the Russians, what the Chinese are doing, are the Americans now fully aware of what the threat is to them? And does Secretary Hegseth's announcement indicate that this is where so much of the focus is going to be going forward?
Well, thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one. Before I provide some thoughts, let me just say that today, my opinions are my own. They don't represent the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, and certainly not the U.S. government. So I think there's a realization across all Western nations and powerful militaries. We could define great powers by membership of the United Nations Security Council, if you like, that the nature of warfare is remaining immutable. It's a clash of wills. Whereas the character of warfare, which is to say how we fight with the emerging technologies of the day, is in fact changing. And so I slightly disagree, if not a lot disagree, with General Hillier that we're seeing a revolution in military affairs. If you took a look at drone warfare, I think we really have to position or contextualize it in certain ways to understand the real effects on the battlefield. We can think about this in terms of the difference between the nature and character of warfare. If by that measure, which I think is correct, what we're seeing is that the character of warfare is certainly changing, where the nature is remaining the same, I believe. We can also take a look at the level of warfare, tactically, operationally, and strategically. In Ukraine, for example, drones have had serious implications tactically, right? They have leveled the playing field. The more capacious power in Russia has not necessarily been brought to its knees, but certainly stymied in its march to Kiev. Operationally, if we talk about the Black Sea, there's been some effectiveness there, and that deals with local economy and the trade of wheat especially. But strategically, we haven't really seen the effects that drone war enthusiasts would like to see, which is to say war termination or achievement of strategic war aims. And furthermore, what I teach students at the U.S. Army War College is to talk about force. So I think there's a realization among the U.S. military that the character of warfare is changing. And by that token, I think the U.S. military has taken the appropriate steps to set a demand signal for industry's partners to start developing at the pace, scale, and scope that we're seeing in Ukraine for these drones in a U.S. context, and furthermore, for defense of the homeland against these drones as well.
Georgie, from your perspective, how has drone technology aided the Ukraine in an asymmetrical conflict with Russia to be able to thwart Russia's ability to move to its intended targets on a timeline that is now so far off of what President Putin had originally forecast?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll start with a few anecdotes for us to dive into what has happened in Ukraine. So first important date is October of 2022. It's the first time when UAVs, or the unmanned vehicles of the Ukrainian seaborne drones, attacked Russian Black Fleet, and it's when it all started, and a country without a naval force was able to dominate the Black Sea, and the Russian vessels had to hide in the ports, and they were not able to continue the blockade in the way they were doing it beforehand. Then February of 2025 is the first time when drones were used to make an only all-drone ground assault, and 30 drones were used without any infantry. And it was a very successful attack, and it was a very interesting attack because it shows that drones can be used on the ground assaults as well. And then May and June. In May, a seaborne drone was able to shoot down the two Russian planes with the launchers attached to them. And then in June of 2025, a seaborne drone was able to take out first-person view drones, which we call FPVs. And these drones were able to destroy the air defense systems. And I will agree with Paul on all of these, that they haven't had any strategic results. But I would say that spiderweb operation, which had happened a few weeks back, actually had a strategic result, because we've seen that using the drones, they were able to destroy a third of strategic aviation of the Russian. And what's more, that it has created questions in the Kremlin, asking if Kremlin or if Russia is actually secure from the Ukrainian attacks, and is strategic depth that Russia has enough to counter the drones that the Ukrainians are developing, because Ukraine was able to attack within 4,500 plus kilometers from the front lines, in the depths of the enemy territory, simultaneously in 5 regions, and was able to cause $7 billion cost of damage with $600,000. So I would say that is strategic, and if you add up all of this together, you will have strategic results. I think that Ukrainians are just figuring out how they can use all of it in combination so that it has a strategic result at the end of the day, and I'm hopeful that it's going to happen sooner than later.
And if I could jump in, Stuart, and just say, look, this is worthy of a complete discussion, a complete podcast of itself. Is there a strategic implication, strategic effect? And I would say there actually is. And if your strategic intent is national survival, then drone warfare has contributed directly to that strategy. And I'm reminded of, I don't know, back in World War II, Winston Churchill's, we hang on by our teeth until the new world with all its power and might comes in to rescue the old world. And kind of that is the strategy in Ukraine. Hang on, survive as a nation until the Western world comes in with all of the strength and power to rescue us from the assault on us. That's a strategic implication right there. And obviously, the drones have had a significant part to play in that, significant implications, not the deciding factor for sure, but in the defense, perhaps more than in the offense. That is to say, survival versus winning the war.
So Calvin, earlier, Rick Hillier pointed out the the data collection, AI influence and impact when it comes to drone warfare and all warfare. How important is this as one of the elements in which we're looking at the disruption in the way that we are engaged in conflicts today?
Well, I think, I'll defer in terms of the kinetic discussion in terms of our colleagues from the military background, but the space particularly that I look at, particularly looking at threat actors like China, is really in that corporate sector, including the battlefields of boardrooms, law offices, research facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think although we're having those discussions at the government level in terms of, supporting in terms of defense and procurement, in terms of kinetic support, I think, our adversaries like China are really looking at perhaps our vulnerabilities, and that is the corporate boardroom in terms of accessing, the information, whether it be our drone technology, we've seen it, in the headlines in recent years in terms of espionage. But they're also looking at using AI in terms of a whole number of ways where ourselves, through regulation, through privacy concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're not really empowering our society to defend themselves in terms of the corporate aspect of it, to not only detect the threat actors, but also to counter the threat actors. So I think we need to kind of have a cultural shift in terms of AI, in terms of kind of looking at the cost benefit analysis in terms of the risk, and that metrics in terms of that huge cultural value in terms of privacy. When it comes down to AI, I think we have to kind of balance that, knowing that our adversaries aren't using that metrics the same way we are. And I think we may have to look at AI in terms of supporting it a lot further than what we have, not only in terms of drone technology, but I think to support the corporate sector, the legal sector, and others that are defending against the adversaries like China, who are really their battlefield. What we've seen is not their preference is to stay out of the kinetic and to keep into the corporate. And I think we have to be looking at that as well.
Paul, Calvin mentions China, and early on in our discussion today, we have not focused on China. How important is it that we stay fully abreast of what is happening in China and mobilizing the resources that we have here to make sure that we are not lagging so far behind that we can't catch up?
Well, in the U.S. military and political context, it's extremely important. If you take a look at our vital national security interests, which is to say those that are linked to order building, it's about peace, prosperity, and security, but also in terms of regional security order building in the Indo-Asian Pacific, what our national military defense strategies tell us, and indeed the national security strategy, is that China is our pacing threat. And for good reason, because for the last 50 years or so, the region, again, the Indo-Asian Pacific, has benefited from the security guarantee provided by the United States. And so if we bring this or link this back to the conversation on drones and AI incorporated within drones, what we're seeing within the U.S. military context is an integration of these capabilities at scale to try to approximate the mass and the interior lines that China has at its advantage in the conflict, let's say, over Taiwan, as well as the South China Sea. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is the driving force behind our strategy. In fact, I think it's dubious to think that drone warfare, however we want to define it, is a strategy in and of itself, and that so-called over-the-horizon capabilities can achieve vital national security interests. I think we have years of data in Afghanistan and certainly the post-war period of the last several years to evidence that. But what we're seeing right now is an approach of joint combined arms maneuver where AI, for instance, is integrated across certain warfighting functions. Intelligence is a prime example, so we could quickly fuse data that would give us targetable tracks to defeat high payoff targets and high value targets. And so I think China is the right pacing sort of threat for the United States for all the reasons that General Hillier has talked about, but we can't make a mountain out of a molehill in terms of what drones can provide us. One final point is this: there are several counterfactual questions. In other words, things that we can't prove about Ukraine in terms of drones that I think we ought to pause and consider. For instance, both sides lack air superiority, which I think has resulted in an artificial inflation of the place of drones in that conflict. And then furthermore, although there are vital national security interests for Ukraine, survival, as General Hillier has talked about, the question I have is this a limited war or is it a total war? I mean, to what degree have both sides really mobilized the industrial base and drew upon allies and partners to achieve their vital security interest? And I just to point to the trade or lack thereof of large armed and networked drones from the United States to Ukraine for fear of crisis escalation. In other words, that this would drive to a point of potential nuclear war, which is a real concern.
General Hillier, your thoughts?
Well, look, if we've talked around it, and Paul has hammered at it from the side, as is Georgie. But the greatest challenge we may have, based on what we're talking about here, the major security disruptors, is not the actual drone itself, not the actual artificial intelligence or intelligence and technology that will enable that drone, that platform, to be so powerful. It is the procurement process that will or will not let us actually have those drones, have the technology, combine them together into the kind of capabilities that we want, and then deliver those capabilities. And I just look at the challenge that we're having right now, and having hunter-killer drones, not to go and hunt down a tank, but to actually go and chase down one of those Shahed, as Georgie mentioned, one of those Shahed drones coming into Kyiv late in the evening, and not have to take, something like this as your target, and then go and shoot it down with a $5 million missile. That is a losing proposition. And we say we're seizing this in the West. I don't believe we are. I just went online and checked. So here in Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces have been procuring a long endurance, long stage drones for 15 years. We're going to have final operational capability in 2033. Then I flash back. I love to read history because you learn so much. In July of 1944, in the Philadelphia shipyards, the United States of America, in one 24-hour period, built and delivered and set sail a Liberty ship, 800 feet of incredible capability, which was part of the winning profile of World War II. Why are we not there now? We cannot afford to have months turn into years on drone technology combined with AI to deliver to the war fighters, to support the war fighters with that umbrella around the world. Our procurement process in every Western nation is going to need that revolution if we're going to be able to support the defense and security mission, whether it's with military fighting, whether it's with our other security agencies, or whether it's a nation at large inside of an alliance. We're going to need a procurement revolution, which we have never seen. Maybe 1940 to 43 in World War II delivered it for us, resulting in that Liberty ship. But right now, we are not there. Procurement is going to be our biggest obstacle here. And so far, I think it's prevented our Western military forces from being ready to fight the kind of fight that is occurring now in the Eastern Oblast, or that fight multiplied out 5 years from now. We're not ready for it because of procurement.
So if we take a look at the announcement from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth last week, he was talking about circumnavigating that procurement process and giving the ability to our personnel in the field to be able to start to procure. Georgie, when we take a look at the Ukrainian experience, would you say that the procurement process may have been in the way before the Russian invasion of the country, but since then, now there is that impetus that has said that procurement process has now been brushed aside?
100%. So I'll start with the numbers. So in 2024, Ukrainians were able to produce, or they had the capacity to produce about 20,000 drones per month. The number is 200 right now. In 2022, their defense industry as a whole was worth, or had a capacity to produce about $1 billion worth of weaponry. The number is 35 billion right now. And all of it was possible through a platform called, most of it was possible, not all of it. It's called Brave One, which unites all the agencies, military and security, all the companies which are both government owned and private owned, with the people who are actually doing the fighting. So people are telling them what they really want, and then people are solving those problems. And Brave One has been so successful that I'll tell you in pure numbers that prototypes can be deployed on the battlefield within from 2 to 6 weeks. And as far as I know, that number is 12 to 24 months for the NATO. And what's most interesting is that with that kind of platform, Ukrainians now have a capacity to produce 4 million drones per year. And it was liked so much, and that platform is so successful that a few days back, or about a week and a half back, they have also launched Brave EU, which will have about $100 million worth of funding. Of course, it's a test, but they want to try to bring that experience into Europe and start using and building solutions, defense solutions for the Europeans using the same method that they've used in Ukraine. So Ukrainian data will be flowing to Europeans so that they start actually building solutions that can be usable on the battlefield with the conventional fight. Because we all have to understand that since I would say since World War II, the war of this scale hasn't been fought in Europe, and a conventional fight of this scale hasn't been fought for decades. And this is very new for everyone, including big players like United States, because United States has experience in non-conventional fight, but doesn't have any experience in conventional fighting. And the experience that is coming or will be coming to Brave EU, and I hope it's successful because there will be a lot of things that need to be solved. But if it is successful, it will bring data from the battlefield of Ukraine to Europeans so that they can start building solutions that can be actually workable solutions on the battlefield for them, as well as the same way as Ukrainians did with the Brave One.
Georgie I agree with everything Georgie has said, and I don't think he has suggested, as hopefully I did not, that we throw out process. You cannot do that. We live in democratic nations where people pay taxes who are going to be, and those dollars and taxes are going to be spent on weaponry. And as Ukraine discovered right at the front end of the war, when you throw out process, you end up with an incomprehensible mess, which wastes time, wastes money, wastes credibility, and wastes lives. And it was only, a few months into the war that you defined those processes to be immediately reactive, using the information from the battlefield, from the soldiers on the front line, so to speak, and then actually to put it into such a quick process that you got the benefit from knowing what was required, marrying technology to it, commencing the development of technology to support it even further, and then producing. You still have to have a process.
So both Rick and Paul, question to you. Do you believe in the West that what we're seeing in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is going to, let's say, move forward or change the perspective on our need to tighten up that procurement process, but it also has to be coupled with voter support? Because we, as you pointed out, Rick, we live in democracies, and without voter support, how do we get our own governments to move forward with speed, albeit done appropriately? Paul, why don't I start with you and then come back to you? And
I may
Paul,
jump in here.
hand to you.
Yeah, I'll take that softball question. So it's actually a compound question. So it may be useful to think about it in two parts. One, with the sort of innovation and procurement issues we've talked about, and two is public opinion. And so I'm one of those who used to look doubtful on U.S. procurement processes, but now in my second tour in the Pentagon, I think there's real value in, as General Hilliard talked about, really aligning to a process and trying to optimize it further. I mean, the reality is what we're talking about here is trying to scale niche capabilities, and it's really important that we assess the degree to which these capabilities are survivable in the sort of expeditionary environments and wartime environments that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine in its war with Russia. First point. The second point is when we talk innovation, it's really important to understand that, especially in a wartime setting, we have bottom-up mechanisms and top-down mechanisms. And in the U.S. military context, I do believe that U.S. senior leaders have taken seriously the implications of especially small, commercially available, easily weaponized drones to try to align our infrastructure, training, and policies to employ them not just abroad for force protection, but in the homeland for protection of installations and our soldiers. So here's just a couple of examples from the Army perspective. So the first example from a bottom-up perspective would be our what we call Army Transformation Initiative. And so we are beta testing capability integrated into new formations across 3 different brigade combat teams across the United States. When we flip down to the top-down perspective, I do have to point to the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, which is managing billions of dollars on behalf of the department pursuant to what we call the Replicator Initiative. And that comes in terms of Replicator 1 and 2. The former is about offensive capability, and the latter is about defensive capability. And the final point that I would add here in the first part of your question is we can talk all but what we have to talk about, Terry, dots, that's really where the secret sauce is, I think, for innovation over time.
Could you just repeat that last point? You were just your feed was just hung up just a little bit.
Yeah, you got to apologize for the storms in the DC metro area, but it's the acronym is DOT-MIL-PFP. So doctrine, organization, training, leadership, policy, and authorities. In order to get this right, especially in a homeland context, to protect ourselves from, let's say, an Operation Spiderweb, you have to think in terms of all of those. Now, flipping to the public opinion piece really briefly, I study this academically, and the assumption that we make often in this area is that public opinion matters, and indeed, I think we have evidence to prove that. We have a representative democracy, so voters communicate one way or another through representatives all the way up to the president. And if we think that's correct, then what you've seen from the president lately is a real response to public opinion. I mean, for instance, last several months, he's issued executive orders. One is establishing a national task force on counter operations, especially in the homeland. And then second of all, it demands the time public opinion per se.
And if I could just jump in, and I would just focus on the public opinion piece. And let me just give you a very specific example here of Canada supporting Ukraine in its fight for survival against Russia. I've been involved supporting in a variety of ways, including chairing the Strategic Advisory Committee for Ukraine, working on behalf of democratic nations everywhere to survive against a dictator that brutally invades you. Canada is, I think, somewhere around $20 billion worth of support and financing to Ukraine, et cetera. And there is a great deal of support for that, but there's probably even more a lack of support for that. And the reason that there is people don't understand. They don't understand why, when they're having a tough time buying groceries, a tough time putting their child into college, not able to obtain housing, the medical system doesn't support them, and they're paying huge amounts of taxes. They're having a tough time understanding why that money needs to go to Ukraine and not to their needs in Canada because they're paying the taxes for it. Nobody in our nation. And as I look across Western Europe, it's almost identical. Nobody in the individual nations there are making the case to the populations, helping shape the public opinion of why Ukraine, why it's important to us, what support they need, why we can provide that support, and why it is so fundamentally important. And secondly, the public opinion piece is going to continue as we talk in the West, particularly that 5% for national security, 5% of GDP applied to defense and security. We've all talked about that now in the Western nations. None of us have gotten to it except maybe Poland. And the ability of each nation to get there, again, those representative democracies, is going to be based upon the willingness of the population to support it at the cost of other things. We have not educated those populations of why, without security, without your defense being appropriate and seamless, if you will, you cannot have medical care, and you cannot have a strong economy, and you cannot have a secure home, and your family cannot get its education and go to school and come home and not be armed. We have to make those arguments publicly, time after time after time. And we've got to focus first of all on the short term. Say, hey, what's in it for you? First of all, I was at a conference in May, on the 10th of May in London, and Prime Minister Starmer spoke, and he talked about he wants to get the defense dividend so that every Briton will get the benefit of the United Kingdom investing a whole lot more in defense and security and the production of all the things that are needed to secure Britain's security, to help secure NATO's security, to help stabilize the world, and then sell all those things, yes, to other friends and allies and their neighbors. And every Briton would get to have jobs and get to earn money and get to have revenue, all because of that. And we need to do the same thing right across Canada, right across France and Germany, because otherwise, that 5%, that could well create a revolution in itself, is not what we want. And then we need to concentrate on the slightly longer term, why it's important to have that kind of defense. Because without that defense expenditure, we will not be able to take the lessons from the Eastern Oblast, the lessons from the Middle East, and translate that into operational capability within NATO, within our own military forces. Public opinion, I think Paul said this, public opinion matters. And most nations are not trying to educate, dare I say it, shape public opinion in any way, shape, or form. One time last year, I found myself speaking about the need to help Ukraine and what Canada should do. And I looked around and really, I was the only person in Canada that was doing it at that moment, at that time frame. And that is not going to achieve the mission. Public opinion matters. We need to put a huge effort into the education of our populations to ensure they understand why, then what, and then what the consequences are when we do it, how positive they can be, and what the consequences are if we don't do it. Public opinion matters.
May I jump in for a second? I think I just want to elaborate on that while we are not doing enough to explain to the public why all of this is important, Russians, on the other hand, are attacking the same public opinion and trust in our institutions because our democracy is flourishing on the trust. Without this trust in the institutions, there is no democracy and there is no strength of our nations. And what Russia is doing is that they are just actually finding weak links and attacking those weak links to destroy the trust and tell the public a completely different story, and the story that is not true, and tell them that while the countries are helping Ukraine, they're actually taking money from other programs, creating dissatisfaction. And that's the bet of Putin thinks that the will of the West is smaller than the strategic depths that he has. Right now, he's not paying a huge political price for everything that he's doing to his country, destroying the future to fuel his ambitions, because he thinks that the will of the West is shorter than his strategic depths. That's why what these gentlemen are saying about public opinion is tremendously important, because without that, we're not staying at the same spot, but we're going backwards.
Calvin, to you.
Yes, I'll just add to some of the comments, and I appreciate and value particularly the lens on the kinetic issues. But I think Georgie just alluded to the disinformation part. But I would even take it, even broader to that. There's going to be a strategic surprise in terms of national security if it already hasn't occurred and isn't occurring now. If we continue to fail, to connect the dots, if we're looking at, say, for example, just the issue in Ukraine or in Israel or whatever else, and we focus purely just on the kinetic aspect of it without looking at the disinformation. But I only have to drive 5 blocks from my recollection from where this is being filmed today to think about at the beginning of the Ukraine war, me walking into a boardroom where Russian entities were hitting a local business to try to destroy the information flow during the course of the war. And that was in the first week of the war. And that was in the cyber domain. And I think whether it's the cyber domain, the electoral domain, the disinformation domain, the transnational organized crime, the illicit finance, the economic subversion, coercion, I think that awareness has to include all. If we just stick on the others, I think the failure is going to be if we don't fuse technology with talent and intelligence and look at connecting the dots, the failure is going to be not connecting the dots. And the drones are, obviously a big dot in this process. But I think there's a lot of other dots that we have to look at. And we look at China, say, for example, and I saw, Stu, you brought in a drone. I wish I brought in a mosquito, but China has a drone that's about 1/10 the size of this little bottle cap in terms of called a mosquito drone. And they're looking at that, to conduct espionage spaces, the true espionage capabilities. The true capabilities of it, though, is unknown, but it is a process. It is an initiative to look at, hey, how do we go into the boardrooms? How do we go into the law offices? How do we go into the research facilities to pull and extract all that technology and all those secrets and that can undermine the larger kind of global conflict and global security issues that we have? So again, I just go, the important is connecting all the dots through this awareness, which is what we're talking about today, is just trying to bring that awareness to the public, because I think it is probably the most critical and the most important way to defend ourselves is through public education and awareness.
Paul, I want to come back to a comment that you had made a little bit earlier, and this is based on a viewer comment. And the comment is, does total war, because you brought this up, mean the use of nuclear weapons as referenced by the Russian government this week?
I may just ask you by virtue of the weather to repeat the question one more time, sir.
Okay. Does total war mean the use of nuclear weapons as referenced by the Russian government this week?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the real worry is that you could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. And of course, we've seen machinations from Putin himself on the reemergence of tactical nuclear weapons. I think total war is a certain construct, going back to General Hiller's comment, that we would have seen recently in World War II, where it's a mobilization of society, we're weaponizing society, as it were, to build material that enables deployment at mass due to existential purposes. The comment that I made was try to wrestle with this question of the place of drones in modern warfare and the outstanding questions about how effective these capabilities are in the context of Ukraine and Russia and that war, where there is a lack of air superiority. And there's a real worry that if you provide more capability in terms of these large armed and networked drones, that you would escalate to a total war sort of position. If we flip and start talking about AI, I think there's a real question here about nuclear escalation if we start to outsource sort of command and control of nuclear capability to AI decision support systems. And so the real worry is that we would potentially jumpstart escalation because of the integration of AI, not despite of it.
So in our pre-panel briefing, we brought up the topic that drones actually in many ways are the poor man's nuke, that they are an alternative weapon. Does the use of drone technology in the conflict, particularly that we see between Russia and Ukraine right now, help to guard against going to that total war footing?
Well, I may just start, then I'll hand it over to my other colleagues here. I mean, one of the great benefits of using drones, among others, is that from a political perspective, it signals that you're doing something and trying to contain escalation, which is frankly the reason why the United States, as a first course among others, would use a drone to respond to the Houthis, Iran, and other non-state actors, terror organizations, transnational terrorists at that. Again, the rule right now is that if you start to unleash drones beyond the geographic confines of Ukraine, and I'm talking specifically about U.S. manufactured drones, that you actually escalate the conflict there in ways that you don't want to. right? And so again, I want to foot stomp that these drones are really effective in achieving tactical effects. You can take a look at the killing of Qasem Soleimani, for instance, by the first Trump administration. But the real worry and outstanding question is to what degree would they escalate to something much broader than that?
And, if I could just jump in and say, we've had those questions in many operations, many conflicts for decades and decades, right? I mean, like, and again, and I said this several times, I apologize, but Georgie and Paul are probably weren't alive, but back in the 80s, the United States of America was contemplating, through the CIA, of arming the Mujahideen who were living in Pakistan with the Stinger air defense missile, the man-pads. And man, it was a controversial decision to do just that, because Russia, through the back sort of networks, through the back doors, was saying, hey, this is going to be a big step and it may lead us to do something entirely different. Hey, guess what? Those Stingers went to Pakistan, to the Mujahideen. It changed the nature of the fight inside of Afghanistan. And sadly, because of the availability of those Stingers, it changed the nature of the fight once the Russians were gone from Afghanistan. But we've dealt with this before. It always has been a strong man's sort of tool, if you will, to trot out the nuclear threat. But a strong man doesn't exist as a strong man all by himself. And around a strong man, even in the most brutal and desperate of times, exists a whole circle of people who understand just what a devastating step Putin would be making if he used or attempted to use a nuclear weapon, and how destructive that would be to them personally, for their lives, for their families, for their livelihoods, and for Russia itself. So, total war, I think Paul got it right. Hey, we're talking World War II, a complete commitment of a society to war. We're not there by any stretch in any place, not even in Ukraine at the moment. Perhaps the closest that we are is Israel.
Georgie, your thoughts?
Again, this is my humble subjective opinion. And I would say that there has been a lot of interesting people saying that a person who is afraid to get infected with COVID will not risk the nuclear weapons. So I think that a person who is sitting with miles away from his greatest advisors because he's afraid that he will be infected with some virus, I don't think that person is ready to use the nuclear weapons. He is definitely blackmailing society, both international and the local, that he will be using those weapons. But I do not think I agree with everything that General has said. I don't think that we are at the danger that nuclear weapons will be used. However, there is one thing. I don't know what he will do if he gets to a point when he understands that he has lost. Because if he has lost in Ukraine, he will be killed. And at that time, when he doesn't have anything to lose, we don't know what he's gonna do. But hopefully, things will happen in Russia as it has always happened. In most cases, regime changes in Russia, both in Russia and Soviet Union, have happened within 3 days. If that happens, he will not have that much time. So I'm staying cautiously optimistic that's not gonna happen, but we can never rule 100% out the possibility of nuclear weapons.
And he'll never believe he's going down. And you're right about somebody who's afraid of getting COVID is not going to use a nuclear weapon. Here's the guy who had people sit 20 feet away from him. He lives on bowls of vitamins every single day. He travels with a team of medical specialists to look after his health. His security is probably the utmost personal security is probably the utmost in the world. This is not a guy who wants to commit seppuku, who wants to commit suicide by using a nuclear weapon in a conflict, which he still perceives he has a chance of winning.
So does the use of drones provide him that cover to stay away from all-out weapons of destruction such as nuclear? And like for us to come back to the central theme here, the role that drones play as we move forward. Paul, why don't I start with you? Yeah.
Well, I think we have to go back to first principles on what we think drones and drone warfare provides. Extension of operational reach, force protection, surgical targeting to the degree that it can reduce collateral damage while protecting your own forces, and a whole host of other considerations that deal with the normative ethics and the legality of these capabilities. I think it is true that Putin, having said that, observed what drones could do to level the playing field between his conflict with Ukraine, and then adopted them as such. Of course, he was given a handout with Iranian investments of Shahed 136s in the initial start of the conflict, but has certainly built out an industrial base to attempt to approximate the pace and scale of Ukrainian investments in manufacturing. And so, yes, I do believe that drones give him the ability to try to approximate the disruptive effect that Ukraine has experienced with these capabilities. Again, the outstanding question for me, sort of an empirical analyst here, is to what degree will these drones potentially in and of themselves provide strategic effects? I think the jury's still out, and it's more about the integration of these capabilities across time and space in campaigning, as it were, to really kind of suss out how the military instrument of power can achieve these strategic war aims.
Georgie?
Well, those are wonderful points, and I would simply add to that, Stuart, if I could, that when you get developments inside of military affairs or for defense and security, you get two themes. Number one is your capability you're bringing on, in this case, drones that we talk about, allow you to do more of what you were doing all along, or do it better, or do it more efficiently, or do it at less risk. In other words, it's a continuation of similar tactics, if not exactly the same, that you've been utilizing for months and sometimes years. And the other aspect of it is, can that capability become, as Paul said, can it become a strategic factor overall? I think there actually is possibility that it could. The great divide between the two, and sometimes the great obstacle, may actually be the military, the defense structure itself. Military structures, as I mentioned, right at the beginning here, really remain the same. We had not structured necessarily to take advantage of new capabilities and how they could fundamentally alter and realign the battlefield in our favor. And secondly, we have certainly not altered, in my view, the way we command, the commander's intent of unleashing those, 19 and 21-year-olds to actually be able to go out and utilize the capabilities, target the enemy's weak points as they have determined them at the tactical level, supported by a feed from the operational and strategic level, and then strike. In the military, we talk all the time, command and control. And sometimes control actually manifests itself as restraining people and holding people back. And I think, every war we go through this. Every time World War II, Winston Churchill went through dozens and dozens of generals, as did Franklin Roosevelt, until he found somebody who could win a war for him, right? The Israelis have done exactly the same thing. Obviously, President Zelensky has done exactly the same thing. You go to those commands until you find the individuals who can empower, enable, and unleash that control part, so it becomes an assist as opposed to holding everything back. Just think about, guys like Paul and George, you have been in the military. When you lay out a map and what you're going to try to achieve, you draw in lines, and you call them control lines, so you can keep people back from them, or keep people from passing them unless you give them the word that they actually can do it, kind of stuff. We're all about control. Sometimes that control manifests itself by keeping people from doing what they could do so well with new kinds of capability. We may be the worst enemies, and our decision-making process and how we control and how we command. And I'm a big believer in commander's intent. Discern what it is you need to achieve, get that message, that understanding right to the 17-year-old soldier on the front line, and let them execute and stand back and keep the focal point in the right area and support that commander's intent being executed, not by control. I'll stop there.
Calvin, and then Georgie, I'll come to you.
Yeah, just knowing that we're coming close to the end of the show, just a quick introduction. I know most of the discussions have been, highly focused on that kinetic battlefield abroad, but I just wanted to introduce the importance of, I think, drones in terms of global security, national security, even in a domestic situation, looking at other hybrid threats, whether it be drones, in terms of monitoring, our coastal areas, in terms of, illicit fishing activities, with foreign state actors, i.e., again, I'm using China again in terms of what are they doing off the coast in terms of espionage activities or other type of activities. Same thing in the Arctic as well, and the same thing with all our borders, where we're having foreign state actors merging with transnational organized crime activities. And I think drones have a huge capability and possible impact and effect in terms of these operations. So I know most of the conversation has been around those kinetic battlefields, but I just think that whole application of drones has a lot broader capability. I mentioned in terms of espionage in boardrooms, but also going even further in terms of the domestic situation with foreign threat actors that are already inside or on our borders already.
So, Georgie, I know that you've got something to say, but let me also put this question out here. We talk about drones, but these are not just autonomous vehicles that are operating independently on their own. There are operators that guide them in. How important in modern warfare and in all other uses of drones are the operators? How highly regarded are they now as military assets? I'll start with you, Georgie.
So again, for now, they are very important because I'll tell you a story, and it's a very interesting story. So what Ukrainians do is that they have a marketplace, and you get points for every target that you destroy. And a human target costs certain points, and the armored vehicle or a plane costs different kind of points. So a bigger target, more points you get. Then you can actually use those points to request more technology or more weaponry. And more points you have, you are getting more stuff to destroy the enemy. So this is a very interesting concept because it ties back to what you were just saying. So how important are the pilots and how important are the people who are actually operating those vehicles? They're very important because they are in competition. Ukrainians understand that, and they're giving them all the tools necessary for them to show how better they are than the others, because better you are, better technology and weaponry you have. That's the first thing. I think I also want to go back to what Calvin was saying, because those small vehicles, they can be very dangerous on the kinetic battle, but they can also be very dangerous on the economical battles as well. I just want to go back a few years back when a small drone just disturbed one of the London's airports for a few hours, and millions of dollars were lost because of that. Can you imagine a few hundred drones doing that simultaneous attack? Not destroying anything, but disturbing airplanes, because everything for us is built so that we are depending on time and schedules. And if we go out of those schedules, economies will be losing millions and some maybe even billions of dollars. And lastly, I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about the drones being poor man's nukes and achieving strategic goals. And I think, again, I will say that yet we haven't seen those results. But if we go back and if we look at the technology and how it's being developed, if the drone swarms are getting to a point in which a lot of drones can attack at the same time in different regions, and if those drones, if they're Russian drones, are attacking power infrastructure and they're destroying the power infrastructure as a whole, are disturbing the whole network and causing the blackouts, it is possible that they will push the society to revolt against Zelensky. Because as long as we talk about it, yes, Ukrainians are fighting for survival. They're resilient, and they're inspiring how persistent they are in fighting the Russians for so many years and how bravely they are doing that. But again, if you unite what drones can do with the psychological operations using the disinformation campaigns that the Russians have developed for so many years, it is possible to create cracks within society and what people think, and they can achieve strategic results if these drones can get to the targets as easily as we think they could if the drone swarm tactics become more and more successful. I'm just going to leave it here. I know that I touched a lot of subject at the same time, but I just wanted to make sure that we are covering everything because I think that all of it together are very, very important.
Well, I'd still like to finish off on this thought about how valuable target is a skilled drone operator. Do they become instrumental targets within any engagement that's being undertaken?
So do you want to go back to that anecdote you were talking about with the English longbowmen that they were destroying them? I think that's a very relevant point there.
Yeah. Rick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had mentioned that, hey, we always targeted those who we perceive to have the highest value based on the capability they have. Battle of Crecy, when the French captured British longbowmen, British archers, they would cut their two fingers off so they couldn't fight anymore using that deadly, deadly longbow. Let me just say that at the end here, I'm reminded, based on what Calvin has said, about the incredible breadth and width, and we've only talked about this portion of it, really, right? But as I sat on a cruise ship a week ago, and in a large theater, watched a swarm of 30 drones perform this intricate ballet, controlled or run by artificial intelligence, not by a drone operator. I'm reminded of its power. And then I was online and just watched a short video of drones helping eradicate wild boar in Texas who are destroying the landscape because they're not native to Texas. It was pretty incredible. And then as I try to help a little bit shape the strategy for Canada's sovereignty and security and defense in the Arctic here, I'm reminded it's the most difficult place in the world to communicate because of the vast distances, the magnetic anomalies, and the difficulties up there, and difficult to see. And drones, particularly ultra long endurance drones, are going to have an absolute place in that network of how we will be enabled in the Arctic. The breadth and width of what is possible is incredible. We've only touched on a little bit of it.
Well, Paul, to the topic of the Arctic, and we take a look at the vast spaces in which we're trying to protect, what role will drones play in our strategic efforts up north? Can you hear me, Paul?
Oh, I lost you for a minute. These storms are tremendous up here. Could you repeat the question?
With regards to the use of drones and what's happening in the north and our efforts to bolster our defenses in the Arctic, what role will drones play? And as General Hillier pointed out, the Arctic presents a tremendous number of challenges.
Well, I think initially it stands to reason they could play a very, very important role for maritime security in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is frankly why the United States is interested in reestablishing a military footprint at larger scale in Greenland by access basing an overflight of the Arctic Ocean, given the melting ice and the opening of the Northern Sea Route. And so it's really important to understand that these capabilities, based upon their endurance, persistence, will provide better maritime awareness, especially given the fact that the United States, at least, lacks vessels that can transit freely within that area. So I'm talking more in terms of icebreakers. Real quick, let me weigh on drone operators. The real rub about drone operators is how they fit into a broader military culture, which is informed by certain norms, especially martial norms, that really emphasize warfighting. And so as far as it goes for drone warfare, drone operators are important. But when you talk to the Air Force, at least, they may not get as much credibility as somebody who's driving a jet. And then on the other hand, drone operators in a domestic context, when we're talking about counter-drone operations, in other words, protecting ourselves, are vitally important, because the policy from the United States military at this point is that we'll always have a person on the loop. In other words, we're not going to outsource decision-making to attempt to intercept, whether lethally or non-lethally, an incoming drone, which means the operator is very important to determine hostile intent or hostile act. And so I think that the drone operator, especially in the homeland, and we could spend another hour on this, is really, really important.
We could spend many hours on this, but we're out of time. Calvin, I'll go to you for a couple of closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Just two quick ones. As we're talking about drones and the importance of them, I think people are out there listening, i.e. our adversaries, and I think we have to be very, very cognizant, which I don't think we are when we talk about awareness and that the whole supply chain in terms of the development of the technology and the capability, there's a big issue relative to the integrity of it in terms of protecting the integrity of building the drones, researching the drones and that. So you can build the best drones, but if the enemy has access to the to the technology in itself because they're part of the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. I think we have to be thinking about that too. As we're talking about drones, being kind of a critical part of the new or the current battlefield. I think we have to be asking ourselves, what are our adversaries seeing, on the horizon? Culturally, we know that we're very in the moment culturally in terms of Western Europe, North America, and even some of our Asian Pacific allies. But our adversaries are known to be chess players and strategic and often have 5, 10, 20, 30-year plans. What are they seeing and what are they looking at? I think is probably something that we need to talk about in the future.
Thanks, Calvin. And thank you to all of our panelists, Paul Lushenko, Rick Hillier, and Georgie Janjalia. This has been a great Security Disruptors event. It will be available online shortly, and we will also be sending out a wide variety of social media clips that we take from this session. And I now encourage you to join us again on August the 20th for our next Security Disruptors panel, Fentanyl, the scourge that has become a national security issue. We'll see you on the 20th of August.